In late December 1949, senior military officers gathered in a Pentagon conference room to review a document that outlined the planned destruction of the Soviet Union. The document, stamped top secret in red ink across every page, was designated Joint Strategic Plans Committee 1920/1, operational codename Dropshot. It detailed how the United States would wage nuclear war against the Soviet Union, beginning with atomic bombardment of approximately 300 targets, followed by conventional military operations involving millions of troops across multiple continents. The officers reviewing the plan were not discussing whether such a war might occur. They were planning how it would be executed if ordered. Before we continue with this documented examination of Operation Dropshot, if you're interested in the declassified history of Cold War military planning and the real strategic decisions that shaped the nuclear age, subscribe and turn on notifications. We examine these carefully researched military plans every week, bringing you the documented evidence from declassified archives. Now, let's look at how this extraordinary plan was developed. The development of Operation Dropshot began in earnest in early 1949, though its conceptual foundations reached back to the closing days of World War II, when American military planners first began to consider the Soviet Union not as an ally against fascism, but as a potential future adversary. The catalyst for formalizing these considerations into a comprehensive war plan was the Soviet Union's successful test of an atomic bomb in August 1949, an event that shattered the American nuclear monopoly years earlier than most Western analysts had predicted. Within weeks of the Soviet test, the Joint Chiefs of Staff directed the Joint Strategic Plans Committee to develop a detailed operational plan for war against the Soviet Union, assuming hostilities would commence in January 1957. The choice of 1957 as the hypothetical war date was deliberate and based on careful calculation. Military planners estimated that by that year, the United States would have accumulated a substantial stockpile of atomic weapons while also having rebuilt conventional military forces that had been dramatically reduced in the years immediately following World War II. In 1949, the United States possessed fewer than 200 atomic bombs. Production capacity was expanding rapidly, and planners projected that by 1957, hundreds of weapons would be available for military operations. Equally important, the bombers capable of delivering these weapons deep into Soviet territory would be available in sufficient numbers. The primary delivery system envisioned in Operation Dropshot was the Convair B-36 Peacemaker, a massive strategic bomber with intercontinental range. The B-36 had entered service with the Strategic Air Command in 1948 and represented a significant leap in capability. With 6 pusher propeller engines and 4 jet engines, the aircraft could carry atomic weapons to targets inside the Soviet Union and return to bases in the United States without refueling. By 1957, planners expected to have substantial numbers of B-36 available, along with the Boeing B-50, an improved version of the B-29 that had dropped atomic bombs on Japan. These aircraft would operate from bases in the continental United States, from forward bases in Britain, and from bases in Okinawa and other Allied territories in the Pacific. The planners also assumed that by 1957, the Soviet Union would have developed its own significant atomic arsenal and would possess the delivery systems necessary to strike targets in Western Europe and potentially in the United States itself. Soviet aviation capabilities were advancing rapidly. The Tupolev Tu-4, a reverse-engineered copy of the American B-29, had entered Soviet service in 1949. More advanced Soviet bombers were under development. American intelligence estimates, provided by the Central Intelligence Agency, projected that by 1957, The Soviet Union could possess hundreds of atomic weapons and the means to deliver them against American forces and potentially against American cities. The plan was premised on the belief that if war came, it would come after both sides had achieved substantial nuclear capabilities, making the conflict far more devastating than World War II had been. The planning process involved collaboration among multiple military departments and agencies. The Joint Strategic Plans Committee, which coordinated the effort, included representatives from the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marine Corps. Each service contributed its specialized expertise. The Air Force provided assessments of bombing capabilities and target selection. The Army developed plans for ground operations in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. The Navy outlined requirements for sea control, amphibious operations, and protection of sea lanes across the Atlantic and Pacific. The Marine Corps contributed plans for amphibious assaults and operations in contested coastal areas. Additional input came from the Central Intelligence Agency regarding Soviet military capabilities, industrial capacity, and leadership structures. The CIA's assessments were based on signals intelligence, human intelligence from sources inside the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, and analysis of Soviet publications and public statements. The Atomic Energy Commission provided technical information regarding the availability and characteristics of atomic weapons, including yield estimates, delivery requirements, and the effects of atomic explosions on various types of targets. The State Department contributed assessments of the political and diplomatic context in which such a war might occur, including likely reactions from allied nations and neutral countries. The planning sessions were conducted with a level of secrecy that exceeded even the normal classifications applied to military plans. Access to the document was restricted to a small number of senior officers and civilian officials who held the necessary security clearances and had a demonstrable need to know. The plan was not shared with Allied governments, even those whose forces would be expected to participate in the operations it outlined. Congressional oversight was minimal, with only a handful of senior members of key committees receiving briefings on the plan's existence and general outlines. The American public had no knowledge that such detailed planning for nuclear war was underway. The plan that emerged was comprehensive in scope and remarkable in its detail. At its core were approximately 300 Soviet targets designated for atomic strikes. These targets fell into several carefully defined categories. Industrial facilities involved in weapons production included factories, manufacturing tanks, artillery, aircraft, and naval vessels. Petroleum refineries and fuel storage depots were prioritized because modern military operations depended entirely on petroleum products, and destroying Soviet fuel capacity would cripple their ability to sustain military campaigns. Power generation facilities, including coal-fired plants and hydroelectric dams, were targeted because industrial production and military operations required reliable electrical power. Transportation hubs received particular attention. Railroad marshalling yards, where trains were assembled and directed, were crucial to Soviet logistics. The Soviet Union's vast geography meant that military forces and supplies had to be moved primarily by rail. Destroying key marshalling yards would disrupt the movement of troops and equipment across the Soviet Union and into Eastern Europe. Ports on the Baltic Sea, the Black Sea, and the Pacific coast were targeted to prevent Soviet naval operations and to disrupt the movement of supplies by sea. Bridges, particularly those crossing major rivers, were designated as high-priority targets because their destruction would create bottlenecks in Soviet transportation networks. Military installations constituted another major target category. Soviet airfields from which bombers might launch retaliatory strikes against the United States or attacks against American forces in Europe and Asia were among the highest priority targets. The plan called for destroying these airfields in the opening hours of the war to reduce the Soviet Union's ability to conduct offensive air operations. Naval bases housing the Soviet submarine fleet and surface vessels were targeted to neutralize the Soviet Navy's ability to threaten American sea lanes. Command and control facilities, including military headquarters and communications centers, were targeted to disrupt Soviet military coordination and decision-making. The targeting philosophy reflected lessons learned from the strategic bombing campaigns of World War II, particularly the recognition that destroying an adversary's industrial capacity and transportation infrastructure could cripple their ability to sustain military operations. However, Operation Dropshot went beyond World War II strategic bombing in both scale and precision. The atomic weapons contemplated in the plan were far more destructive than conventional bombs. A single atomic bomb could destroy an entire industrial complex or military installation that would have required hundreds of conventional bombing sorties during World War II. This meant that 300 atomic strikes could accomplish what would have required tens of thousands of conventional bombing missions. These strikes would be delivered within the first 30 days of war, primarily by Strategic Air Command bombers operating from bases in the United States, Britain, Okinawa, and other Allied territories. The operational concept called for launching waves of bombers that would penetrate Soviet air defenses, deliver their weapons, and return to base. The planners anticipated that Soviet air defenses would improve substantially between 1949 and 1957. Soviet fighter aircraft, anti-aircraft artillery, and early radar systems would pose threats to American bombers. The plan assumed significant aircraft losses, but calculated that enough bombers would reach their targets to achieve the required level of destruction. Beyond the atomic offensive, the plan outlined massive conventional military operations that would follow the nuclear strikes. In Western Europe, American and Allied forces would face a Soviet ground offensive expected to sweep across West Germany, the Low Countries, and potentially France. Soviet conventional military superiority in Europe was overwhelming in 1949, with the Red Army maintaining millions of troops and thousands of tanks in Eastern Europe and the Western Soviet Union. NATO forces, by contrast, were relatively small and would require substantial reinforcement from the United States. The plan acknowledged that Soviet forces would likely achieve significant territorial gains in the early stages of war. American and Allied forces would attempt to halt the Soviet advance, trading space for time while atomic strikes degraded Soviet logistics and reinforcement capabilities. This defensive operation would be supported by tactical atomic weapons used against concentrations of Soviet forces and against supply lines extending back into Eastern Europe and the Western Soviet Union. The use of tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield was envisioned as a way to offset Soviet numerical superiority in conventional forces. After the initial atomic strikes had degraded Soviet military capabilities and industrial capacity, Allied forces would launch counteroffensives eastward across Europe. The plan envisioned liberating occupied territories in West Germany, the Low Countries, France, and potentially pushing into Eastern Europe. Whether Allied forces would actually invade the Soviet Union itself was left somewhat ambiguous in the plan, depending on circumstances and the level of Soviet resistance. The objective was the complete military defeat of the Soviet Union and the elimination of its ability to threaten Western Europe and American interests. Simultaneously, operations would be conducted in other theaters. In the Middle East, American and Allied forces would move to secure oil-producing regions in Iran, Iraq, and the Arabian Peninsula. Soviet forces were expected to advance southward through Iran toward the Persian Gulf, seeking to seize oil fields and potentially to threaten the Suez Canal. American and British forces would attempt to halt this advance and to maintain control of Middle Eastern oil, which was essential both for Allied military operations and for the industrial economies of Western Europe. In the Far East, American forces would defend Japan, South Korea, and other Allied positions against potential Soviet or Chinese attacks. The plan was developed before the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950, but it anticipated the possibility of communist aggression in Asia. American air and naval forces would operate from bases in Japan, Okinawa, and the Philippines. Ground forces would defend key positions and potentially conduct operations to secure areas from which strategic bombing operations against the Soviet Union could be mounted. The logistics requirements for these operations were detailed extensively in planning documents. Planners calculated the tonnage of supplies that would need to be shipped across the Atlantic to support operations in Europe. Food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, spare parts, and all the other necessities of modern warfare would have to be transported from the United States to European ports and then distributed to forward units. The plan identified requirements for thousands of transport ships and merchant vessels. The Battle of the Atlantic during World War II had demonstrated the vulnerability of sea lanes to submarine attack, and the plan anticipated that Soviet submarines would attempt to interdict American supply lines. Fuel consumption presented particular challenges. Modern military forces consumed enormous quantities of petroleum products. Tanks, trucks, aircraft, and ships all required fuel, and the amounts involved were staggering. Planners calculated daily fuel requirements for various types of operations and determined how much fuel would need to be stockpiled in advance and how much would need to be shipped continuously from the United States. Petroleum refineries in the United States would need to operate at maximum capacity to meet military requirements while also providing fuel for the civilian economy. According to the plan's estimates, mobilization would require converting substantial portions of the American economy to wartime production. Factories producing consumer goods would need to shift to military production. Automobile plants would manufacture tanks and military vehicles. Electronics factories would produce radios, radar equipment, and other military electronics. The scale of mobilization envisioned in Operation Dropshot was comparable to American mobilization during World War II, when unemployment virtually disappeared as factories operated around the clock producing war materials. The plan also contemplated implementing rationing of consumer goods to ensure that critical materials were available for military production. Metals, rubber, petroleum products, and other strategic materials would be prioritized for military use. American civilians would face restrictions on purchasing automobiles, appliances, and other goods that required these materials. Rationing had been accepted during World War II as a necessary sacrifice, and planners assumed it would be accepted again if war came. Manpower requirements were equally daunting. The plan envisioned mobilizing millions of American troops for operations in Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. This would require either a dramatic expansion of voluntary enlistment or the implementation of conscription. During World War II, the United States had drafted millions of men into military service. The selective service system, which had been allowed to lapse after World War II, would need to be reactivated. Training these troops, equipping them, and transporting them to theaters of operation would require months of preparation. Unlike the initial atomic offensive, which would be executed within the first month, planners projected the overall conflict would last several years, from commencement to final defeat and occupation of the Soviet Union. This timeline reflected the planners' understanding that even massive atomic strikes would not immediately destroy the Soviet Union's ability to resist. Soviet forces would still number in the millions. The Soviet Union's geographic expanse would provide strategic depth, allowing for withdrawal and regrouping, and the Soviet government and military command structure might survive the initial strikes and continue to direct resistance. The human cost was calculated with the same methodical attention applied to logistics. Planning documents projected millions of Soviet casualties from the initial atomic strikes. While exact figures varied depending on assumptions about weapon yields, targeting accuracy, and Soviet civil defense measures, estimates consistently projected deaths in the millions. These figures did not account for deaths from subsequent radiation exposure, from the breakdown of civil society and medical services, or from the conventional military operations that would follow. The planners acknowledged that actual casualties could be substantially higher, depending on factors including weather conditions, bombing accuracy, and the effectiveness of Soviet civil defense measures, but the estimates provided were treated as baseline figures for planning purposes. The projected casualties included not only deaths, but also serious injuries from burns, radiation exposure, and trauma from blast effects. The medical consequences of atomic warfare were not fully understood in 1949, but planners recognized that the effects would be catastrophic. Hospitals would be destroyed, medical personnel would be killed, and the number of casualties would overwhelm any surviving medical infrastructure. Many of those who survived the initial explosions would die in the days and weeks that followed from radiation sickness, untreated injuries, and the collapse of food and water supplies. The plan also addressed the question of Soviet retaliation. By 1957, planners assumed the Soviet Union would possess its own atomic arsenal and the means to deliver it. The plan anticipated Soviet atomic strikes against targets in Western Europe, against American forces deployed overseas, and potentially against cities in the United States. American intelligence estimates of Soviet bomber capabilities suggested that Soviet aircraft could reach targets in Western Europe with relative ease. Reaching targets in the continental United States would be more challenging for Soviet bombers in 1957, but planners could not rule out the possibility of Soviet attacks against American cities, particularly those on the coasts. American civil defense measures were discussed in the plan, though not in the same detail as offensive military operations. The concept of civil defense was still relatively new in 1949. During World War II, American cities had not faced direct attack, and there was little practical experience with protecting civilian populations from aerial bombardment. The plan referenced the need for evacuation of urban populations, dispersal of industrial facilities to make them less vulnerable to attack, and hardening of critical infrastructure, including government facilities and communications centers. However, the plan acknowledged that these measures would be only partially effective. The destructive power of atomic weapons was so great that even well-prepared civil defense could not prevent massive casualties if Soviet bombers reached American cities. The plan's estimates suggested that American civilian casualties from Soviet atomic retaliation could number in the hundreds of thousands or potentially millions, depending on how many Soviet bombers penetrated American air defenses and how many American cities were struck. This acceptance of massive American casualties as a likely consequence of war represented a fundamental shift from earlier American military thinking, which had assumed that the continental United States would remain a sanctuary safe from direct attack. Operation Dropshot existed within a broader context of American nuclear war planning during the early Cold War period. It was not the first such plan. It had been preceded by plans designated Pincher, Broiler, Half Moon, and others developed between 1945 and 1949. Each iteration of nuclear war planning reflected both the evolution of American military capabilities and shifts in assessments of Soviet capabilities and intentions. Pincher, developed in 1946, had contemplated a much smaller atomic offensive because the United States possessed only a handful of atomic bombs at that time. Broiler and Half Moon, developed in 1947 and 1948 respectively, had incorporated growing American atomic stockpiles and improving delivery capabilities. Dropshot represented the state of American nuclear war planning at a particular moment, late 1949, when the Soviet atomic test had fundamentally altered strategic calculations, but before the development of thermonuclear weapons would render even the massive destruction outlined in Dropshot relatively modest by comparison to what would become possible. The plan assumed that atomic weapons would have yields measured in kilotons, thousands of tons of TNT equivalent. The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki had yields of approximately 15 and 21 kilotons, respectively. The atomic bombs envisioned for use in Operation Dropshot would have similar or somewhat larger yields. Within a few years, however, the development of thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs with yields measured in megatons, millions of tons of TNT equivalent, would fundamentally change the calculus of nuclear war. A single thermonuclear weapon could destroy an entire city that might have required dozens of atomic bombs under Operation Dropshot. The destructive power available to both superpowers would increase by orders of magnitude, making the already catastrophic casualties outlined in Dropshot seem almost modest by comparison. The plan was formally approved by the Joint Chiefs of Staff in December 1949 and was filed in secure storage facilities at the Pentagon and at several other military installations. Copies were provided to commanders of major military forces who would be responsible for executing portions of the plan if war occurred. The commander of Strategic Air Command received detailed targeting information and operational plans for the atomic offensive. Commanders of army forces in Europe received plans for defensive operations against Soviet ground forces and for subsequent counteroffensives. Naval commanders received plans for protecting sea lanes, conducting amphibious operations, and engaging Soviet naval forces. The plan was to be reviewed and updated periodically to account for changes in the strategic environment, advances in military technology, and new intelligence regarding Soviet capabilities. In practice, the plan was updated frequently throughout the early 1950s as American atomic stockpiles grew, as new bomber aircraft entered service, as intelligence assessments of Soviet capabilities evolved, and as the international situation changed. Each update refined targeting lists, revised casualty estimates, and adjusted operational concepts based on the latest information available. The secrecy surrounding Dropshot was maintained not only to prevent Soviet intelligence from obtaining detailed information about American war plans, but also to avoid domestic political controversy. Military and civilian officials understood that public knowledge of detailed plans for nuclear war might provoke opposition from peace activists, concern from religious leaders, and questions from members of Congress about the morality and strategic wisdom of such planning. The decision was made to keep the plan classified at the highest levels and to limit discussion, even within government circles, to those with a clear operational need to know. However, the existence of such plans was not entirely unknown. Soviet intelligence services were aware, through various means, including signals, intelligence, and human sources, that American military planners were developing comprehensive war plans. Soviet intelligence agencies, particularly the GRU, military intelligence, and the KGB, focused substantial resources on penetrating American military planning processes. While Soviet intelligence likely did not obtain complete copies of documents like Operation Dropshot, they understood the general nature of American planning through intercepted communications, through observation of American military exercises and deployments, and through information provided by spies. This knowledge informed Soviet military planning, which included its own detailed preparations for war with the United States and its NATO allies. The Soviet General Staff developed war plans that contemplated rapid offensives into Western Europe, atomic strikes against American forces and European cities, and defensive operations to protect Soviet territory against American attacks. The result was a situation in which both superpowers maintained detailed plans for mutual destruction while simultaneously working through diplomatic channels to prevent those plans from ever being implemented. The dynamic created by this mutual planning was complex and paradoxical. On one hand, the existence of detailed war plans and the military capabilities to execute them contributed to deterrence. Each side understood that the other possessed not only atomic weapons, but also comprehensive plans for their use, and the conventional military forces necessary to follow up nuclear strikes. This understanding created powerful incentives to avoid actions that might trigger war. On the other hand, the existence of detailed war plans created organizational momentum within military establishments on both sides, reduced flexibility in crisis management, and meant that if war did begin, it might rapidly escalate to the catastrophic levels outlined in plans like Operation Dropshot. Among the officers and planners involved in developing Operation Dropshot, perspectives on the plan varied considerably. Some believed war with the Soviet Union was inevitable given the fundamental ideological incompatibility between the two systems and the zero-sum nature of Cold War competition. These officers viewed Dropshot not as a contingency plan, but as preparation for an approaching reality. They pointed to Soviet actions in Eastern Europe, where communist governments had been imposed on Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and other nations, as evidence of Soviet expansionism that would eventually lead to military confrontation. From this perspective, thorough preparation was not only prudent, but morally necessary to defend freedom against totalitarianism. Others viewed the plan primarily as a deterrent, a capability that needed to exist and be known to Soviet intelligence in order to discourage Soviet aggression. If the Soviet Union understood that American war plans were comprehensive and well-developed, the thinking went, Soviet leaders might be less likely to initiate conflict. From this perspective, the plan's value lay not in its execution, but in its existence. The very fact that such detailed preparation had been undertaken would communicate American resolve and capability to Moscow, potentially preventing the war the plan outlined. Still others involved in the planning process harbored private doubts about the entire enterprise, though these concerns were rarely expressed during the planning sessions themselves. In oral history, interviews conducted decades later, after the Cold War had ended and the plans had been declassified, several participants acknowledged discomfort with planning operations that would result in millions of deaths. One former officer described the experience of reviewing casualty estimates as surreal, noting that the numbers were so large they became abstract, losing any connection to the reality of individual human deaths. Another recalled that discussions of atomic targeting were conducted in language borrowed from industrial planning, reducing productive capacity, degrading capabilities, eliminating assets, language that obscured what was actually being planned. These reflections came years after the fact, shaped by the perspective that comes with historical distance and the knowledge that the Cold War eventually ended without the catastrophic war that had been planned for. During the planning process itself, professional competence and operational focus took precedence over moral qualms. The institutional culture of the military emphasized duty, following orders, and preparing for contingencies rather than questioning the fundamental premises of assigned tasks. Officers who harbored doubts typically kept them private, focusing on executing their professional responsibilities as competently as possible. The language and methodology of Operation Dropshot reflected a profound psychological and bureaucratic distancing from the human reality of what was being planned. Casualties were presented in statistical tables with rows and columns showing projected deaths and injuries organized by target category and geographic region. Atomic strikes were described in terms of delivery schedules, sortie rates, and target coverage percentages. The destruction of entire cities was discussed in the context of eliminating military-industrial complexes and degrading war-making capacity. The plan read, in many sections, like a logistics manual or an industrial production schedule, rather than a blueprint for the most destructive war in human history. This abstraction was not accidental. It served essential psychological and organizational functions that made the planning possible. For the planners themselves, the abstraction was perhaps psychologically necessary to perform their assigned function. It would have been impossible to plan operations explicitly aimed at killing millions of specific individual human beings with names and families and lives. The human mind cannot readily comprehend suffering on that scale or maintain emotional engagement with millions of individual deaths. The abstraction allowed planners to focus on operational requirements, strategic objectives, and technical capabilities without confronting the full moral weight of what they were preparing. The statistical presentation of casualties, millions reduced to numbers in tables, created cognitive distance between the planners and the human cost of the operations they outlined. A table showing 2.7 million projected deaths does not convey the reality of 2.7 million individual people dying in atomic fireballs or from radiation sickness in the days and weeks that follow. It does not capture the reality of children separated from parents, of hospitals overwhelmed with dying patients, of cities reduced to radioactive rubble, of survivors facing starvation and disease in the aftermath of nuclear war. The numbers in the tables were accurate in a statistical sense, but they were deeply misleading in a human sense because they reduced incalculable suffering to data points. From an organizational perspective, bureaucratic language facilitated coordination among multiple agencies and military services. Technical terminology and standardized formats enabled specialized contributions to a common plan. The language of military planning, targets, assets, capabilities, degradation, provided a shared vocabulary that enabled complex coordination while simultaneously avoiding the emotional and moral dimensions that might have complicated or paralyzed the planning process. An Air Force officer could discuss targeting requirements with an Army officer and a Navy officer using this shared language without any of them having to confront explicitly what they were planning. But this distancing came at a cost. The same mechanisms that enabled thorough and competent planning also meant that fundamental questions about the morality and rationality of nuclear war plans were often not engaged with seriously within the planning process itself. The focus remained on how to execute a nuclear war effectively rather than on whether such execution could be morally justified or whether the assumptions underlying the plan were sound. Questions like whether the Soviet Union actually posed a threat that justified planning for the deaths of millions of Soviet civilians, whether alternatives to nuclear war might exist, whether the massive destruction outlined in the plan would actually achieve American strategic objectives, these questions were largely outside the scope of the planning process. The plan was developed within institutional frameworks that defined the role of military planners as preparing operational options for civilian leaders, not as evaluating the moral or strategic wisdom of those options. The planners were not asked to determine whether war with the Soviet Union was likely or desirable, only to prepare for how such a war would be fought if civilian leaders ordered it. This division of responsibility, military planners develop options, civilian leaders decide whether to execute them, was fundamental to civilian control of the military. But it also meant that the people developing the most detailed and technically sophisticated war plans were explicitly discouraged from questioning the premises of those plans. The moral dimension of Operation Dropshot raises questions that resist easy resolution. The plan accepted millions of Soviet civilian deaths as a necessary consequence of military operations. These were not uniformly distributed casualties of combat, but concentrated deaths from atomic strikes on urban and industrial areas. The victims would include children, elderly people, individuals with no connection to military production, people who had no voice in Soviet policy, and no ability to influence the decisions that made them targets. The planners' justification, when articulated, invoked the concept of total war. In conflict between modern industrial states, civilian industry and populations are essential to military capacity, making them legitimate targets. This logic, which had been used to justify strategic bombing of Germany and Japan in World War II, was extended to nuclear planning. Soviet factories produced weapons, Soviet workers staffed those factories, therefore Soviet industrial complexes and surrounding populations could be targeted militarily. The principle of distinction between combatants and civilians, central to the just war tradition and to the laws of war, was not formally abandoned, but it was effectively overridden by operational considerations and by the logic of deterrence. But this reasoning contained a fundamental moral problem. The workers in Soviet factories were not there by choice. They lived under a totalitarian system that gave them no political voice, no ability to oppose their government's policies, no option to refuse participation in military production. Soviet citizens in 1949 lived under Stalin's brutal dictatorship, a system that had killed millions of its own people through forced collectivization, political purges, and the Gulag labor camp system. Soviet workers had no more freedom to oppose their government's policies than prisoners have freedom to oppose prison administrators. They were, in effect, hostages of their own government. And the American plan, developed in the name of defending freedom against totalitarianism, called for their deaths as a means to defeat that totalitarianism. The Soviet civilians who would have died had Operation Dropshot been executed bore no individual responsibility for Stalin's policies, for Soviet aggression in Eastern Europe, or for the Cold War confrontation. They were victims not of their own choices, but of a geopolitical conflict in which they were pawns. A factory worker in Leningrad assembling machinery had no more control over Soviet military policy than a Detroit factory worker had over American policy. A teacher in Kiev preparing lessons for students, a doctor in Moscow treating patients, a farmer working the land near Minsk, these people lived under a repressive system they had not chosen and could not change. The question of whether nuclear war planning could be morally justified remains contested among ethicists, strategists, and historians. Some argue the United States faced a genuine existential threat from Soviet totalitarianism and had an obligation to prepare to defend itself and free societies by any means necessary, including nuclear weapons. From this perspective, the alternative to maintaining nuclear war plans was either capitulation to Soviet expansion or reliance on conventional forces that might prove inadequate against Soviet numerical superiority in Europe and Asia. The plans, however horrifying their content, were necessary deterrents that prevented the very war they outlined. Without such planning and without the military capabilities to execute it, the argument goes, Soviet leaders might have been emboldened to expand aggressively, potentially triggering a war that American unpreparedness would make even more costly. Others argue that planning operations certain to kill millions of civilians cannot be morally justified regardless of the threat, and that alternatives, stronger conventional defense, more serious diplomatic engagement, acceptance of higher risk in order to preserve moral constraints, should have been pursued more seriously. From this perspective, Operation Dropshot represented not responsible planning, but a normalization of mass killing, a bureaucratization of potential genocide that made nuclear war seem like a viable policy option rather than an unthinkable catastrophe. The existence of detailed plans, these critics argue, lowered the psychological and political barriers to their implementation by making nuclear war seem manageable and winnable rather than catastrophic for all involved. What distinguishes Operation Dropshot from earlier military planning is not the acceptance of civilian casualties which characterized warfare throughout the 20th century, but the scale and the premeditation. The deaths were not incidental to military operations. They were anticipated, calculated, and accepted in advance. The plan did not call for minimizing civilian casualties where possible. It prioritized targets based on military necessity, with civilian deaths treated as acceptable consequences. The language of military necessity, strategic imperatives, and acceptable losses made thinkable what in human terms was unthinkable. The strategic situation that Operation Dropshot was designed to address continued to evolve rapidly in the early 1950s. The Korean War, which began in June 1950, demonstrated that Cold War tensions could escalate to actual military conflict, though in a limited and geographically contained form, rather than the global conflagration outlined in Dropshot. The Korean War began when North Korean forces, equipped and supported by the Soviet Union and China, invaded South Korea. The United States and other United Nations members intervened to defend South Korea, leading to a 3-year conflict that killed millions and devastated the Korean peninsula, but did not escalate to direct war between the United States and the Soviet Union. The Korean War's implications for nuclear war planning were significant. It demonstrated that limited conflicts could occur without necessarily triggering global war, raising questions about whether the all-or-nothing approach embodied in Operation Dropshot was the only or best strategy. It also revealed challenges in alliance management, logistics, and the difficulties of fighting conventional wars in Asia. The Korean experience led to revisions in American war plans that attempted to account for the possibility of limited conflicts that might or might not escalate to the general war outlined in Dropshot. Even more significant was the development of thermonuclear weapons by both the United States and the Soviet Union in the early 1950s. The United States successfully tested its first thermonuclear device in November 1952. The Soviet Union followed with its own thermonuclear test in August 1953. These weapons, commonly called hydrogen bombs, achieved their destructive power through nuclear fusion rather than the fission reactions that powered atomic bombs. The difference in destructive power was staggering. While atomic bombs had yields measured in kilotons, thermonuclear weapons had yields measured in megatons, thousands of times more powerful. A single thermonuclear weapon could destroy an entire metropolitan area that might have required dozens of atomic bombs under Operation Dropshot. The destructive power available to both superpowers increased by orders of magnitude within just a few years of Dropshot's development. This fundamentally changed the calculus of nuclear war. The casualties outlined in Operation Dropshot, already measured in the millions, would be dwarfed by the casualties from a thermonuclear war. Estimates began to project deaths in the tens of millions, or potentially hundreds of millions, if both sides employed their full arsenals. The growing Soviet nuclear arsenal and the development of long-range Soviet bombers capable of reaching the United States meant that American planners had to account for the possibility of devastating attacks on American cities, not just on American forces deployed overseas. The Soviet Union's development of the Myasishchev M4 and Tupolev Tu-95 bombers in the mid-1950s gave the Soviets credible capability to strike targets in the continental United States. This development transformed the strategic situation from one in which the United States was relatively safe from direct attack to one in which American cities faced the same threats as European cities. These changes necessitated revisions to war plans. Operation Dropshot was superseded by new plans that incorporated thermonuclear weapons, that accounted for larger Soviet nuclear forces, and that attempted to address the problem of how to fight a war in which both sides possessed the capability to inflict catastrophic damage on the other's homeland. These successor plans maintained the basic structure of Dropshot, an initial nuclear offensive followed by conventional military operations, but they escalated the projected scale of destruction to levels that made even Dropshot's massive casualties seem modest by comparison. By the 1960s, the idea that a nuclear war could be fought and won in any meaningful sense had largely been abandoned in favor of the grimmer logic of mutual assured destruction. The recognition that both superpowers possessed the capability to destroy each other, regardless of who struck first, led to a strategic stability based on the certainty of retaliation rather than on the hope of victory. Nuclear weapons came to be seen not as instruments of war fighting, but as instruments of deterrence, tools whose purpose was to prevent their own use by making the consequences of war unacceptable to both sides. The declassification of Operation Dropshot occurred gradually. Beginning in the 1970s as part of broader efforts to release historical military documents, and continuing through the 1980s and 1990s. The process was driven by several factors. The passage of time made the specific targeting information and operational concepts in the plan less sensitive from a security perspective. The strategic situation had changed so fundamentally with the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles, thermonuclear weapons, and new strategic concepts that the 1949 plan was clearly obsolete. Historians and researchers interested in Cold War history pressed for release of the documents. The Freedom of Information Act, passed in 1966, provided legal mechanisms for requesting declassification of government documents. Even today, portions of the plan remain classified, particularly those sections dealing with specific intelligence sources and methods that might still be sensitive. But enough has been released to allow historians and analysts to examine the plan's contents and to understand the nature of early Cold War nuclear planning in ways that had not been possible when the documents remained secret. The declassified portions have been deposited in the National Archives and are available to researchers, providing a detailed window into how American military planners thought about nuclear war in the early Cold War period. The scholarly and public reaction to the declassified portions of Operation Dropshot has been mixed. Some historians and strategic analysts have viewed the plan as evidence of serious and responsible military planning in the face of a genuine Soviet threat. They argue that the United States had an obligation to prepare for the possibility of war with the Soviet Union, and that Operation Dropshot represented a professional and thorough approach to that preparation. These analysts note that the plan was never implemented, that it existed as a contingency rather than as a blueprint for an aggressive war, and that the existence of such detailed planning may have contributed to deterrence by demonstrating American resolve and capability. These defenders of the planning process point out that military establishments exist to prepare for worst-case scenarios, that planning for war does not mean desiring war, and that the alternative to detailed planning would have been unpreparedness that might have emboldened Soviet aggression or left the United States unable to respond effectively if war occurred. They note that Soviet military planning during the same period was equally detailed and equally focused on preparing for total war, suggesting that American planning was a rational response to a genuine threat rather than paranoid overreaction. Other analysts have viewed Operation Dropshot as evidence of the dangers of militarized thinking during the Cold War. They point to the plan's acceptance of massive civilian casualties, its assumption that nuclear war could be fought and won through superior planning and resources, and its lack of serious engagement with the moral dimensions of nuclear warfare. These critics argue that plans like Dropshot normalized the concept of nuclear war, making it seem like a viable policy option rather than an unthinkable catastrophe, and that this normalization increased the risk that such a war might actually occur. From this critical perspective, the problem with Operation Dropshot was not that it existed. Some level of contingency planning was arguably necessary, but that it embodied assumptions about the controllability and winnability of nuclear war that were fundamentally flawed. The plan assumed that nuclear war would follow a predictable pattern, that American forces would be able to execute complex operations according to schedule, that Soviet responses would be manageable, and that the conflict could be brought to a successful conclusion with the Soviet Union defeated and American strategic objectives achieved. Critics argue that these assumptions were dangerously optimistic and that they reflected a failure to grasp the fundamentally different nature of nuclear warfare compared to conventional conflicts. The human dimension of Operation Dropshot is perhaps most starkly illustrated by considering the Soviet civilians who would have been the plan's victims had it been executed. The millions of projected Soviet deaths were not military casualties or combatants who had chosen to bear arms. They were human beings living their lives in Soviet cities and towns who would have been incinerated, crushed, or fatally irradiated in pursuit of American strategic objectives. These individuals had no role in determining Soviet foreign policy, no voice in the decisions made by Stalin and the Soviet leadership, and no agency in the Cold War confrontation. Consider a specific example to make the abstraction concrete. One of the targets identified in Operation Dropshot was the city of Gorky, now known as Nizhny Novgorod, located on the Volga River about 250 miles east of Moscow. Gorky was a major industrial center, home to factories producing automobiles, aircraft, and military equipment. Under Operation Dropshot, Gorky would have been targeted with atomic weapons aimed at destroying its industrial capacity. An atomic strike on Gorky would have killed hundreds of thousands of people: factory workers, their families, teachers, doctors, shopkeepers, children, elderly people, the entire population of a major city. A factory worker assembling machinery in Gorky had no more control over Soviet military policy than a Detroit factory worker had over American policy. A teacher in Gorky preparing lessons for students, a doctor treating patients, a mother caring for children. These people lived under a repressive system they had not chosen and could not change. They had no opportunity to vote against Stalin's policies, no freedom to protest Soviet actions in Eastern Europe, no ability to influence the decisions that put them in the crosshairs of American nuclear planning. They would have died, not knowing why, not understanding what conflict their deaths were meant to serve. Victims of strategic calculations made by planners who never knew them and never thought of them as individuals. Multiply this example by dozens or hundreds of Soviet cities and towns, and the human cost of Operation Dropshot begins to come into focus. Millions of individual deaths, each one a unique human being with a life, with relationships, with hopes and fears and experiences. Millions of families destroyed, millions of children orphaned or killed. Millions of lives cut short, not because of anything they had done, but because they lived in a country whose government American planners had identified as a threat. The same could be said, of course, of Soviet war planning, which included its own preparations for nuclear strikes against American and Allied targets, and which would have resulted in massive American civilian casualties had war occurred. Soviet planners had their own target lists, their own casualty estimates, their own operational concepts for waging nuclear war against the United States. The Cold War nuclear confrontation was characterized by mutual planning for mutual destruction, with both sides developing increasingly elaborate and devastating war plans while simultaneously working to prevent those plans from ever being implemented. The question of whether Operation Dropshot and similar plans made war more or less likely remains contested and perhaps unanswerable. The deterrence argument suggests that Soviet knowledge of American preparedness discouraged Soviet aggression and thus prevented war. According to this logic, if the Soviet Union understood that the United States had detailed plans for nuclear war, substantial atomic arsenals, the delivery systems to employ them, and the will to use them if necessary, Soviet leaders would be deterred from actions that might trigger American retaliation. The fact that the Cold War never escalated to the general war outlined in Dropshot is cited as evidence that deterrence worked. The opposite argument suggests that the existence of detailed war plans, the investment of resources in capabilities to execute those plans, and the organizational momentum of military institutions created pressures toward confrontation and reduced flexibility in crisis management. From this perspective, having detailed plans for nuclear war made war more thinkable and therefore more likely. The plans created institutional interests within military establishments on both sides that favored maintaining and expanding nuclear arsenals, that interpreted ambiguous situations as threats, and that pushed for confrontational policies. The existence of the plans meant that in a crisis, military and political leaders had ready-made options for escalation, options that might be chosen because they existed and had been carefully prepared rather than because they represented the best response to the situation. What is clear is that Operation Dropshot represented a particular moment in the evolution of Cold War strategy, a moment when American military planners believed that nuclear war with the Soviet Union could be fought, survived, and won through superior planning, resources, and will. This belief would be challenged in subsequent decades as the destructive power of nuclear weapons increased, as delivery systems became more sophisticated and harder to defend against, and as the concept of mutual assured destruction came to dominate strategic thinking. The idea that a nuclear war could be fought and won in any meaningful sense gradually gave way to the recognition that such a war would destroy both societies regardless of who struck first or how well prepared they were. The question of civilian leadership and control over nuclear war planning was itself contested during this period and throughout the Cold War. The civilian leadership, the president and his advisers, had ultimate authority to order military action, including the execution of war plans like Operation Dropshot. The president alone had the authority to order the use of nuclear weapons. But the development of the plans themselves, the selection of targets, the determination of requirements, The calculation of forces needed, this was largely the domain of military planners operating with limited civilian oversight. This created a situation in which the military developed increasingly elaborate and destructive war plans without sustained civilian engagement with the strategic and moral implications of those plans. Civilian leaders were briefed on the plans in general terms, but the detailed operational planning was left to military professionals. This division of labor made sense from the perspective of expertise. Military planners had the technical knowledge necessary to develop complex operational plans, but it also meant that fundamental strategic and moral questions might not receive the attention they deserved. The gap between military planning and civilian control would become a recurring issue throughout the Cold War. Civilian leaders sometimes discovered, to their surprise, the nature of the plans that had been developed in their name. The assumption that nuclear war could be fought according to detailed plans, that it would follow a predictable course, that civilian leaders would maintain control throughout. These assumptions would be challenged repeatedly as the destructive power of nuclear arsenals grew and as the speed of potential conflicts accelerated with the development of intercontinental ballistic missiles that could reach their targets in 30 minutes or less. The few military planners who later discussed their involvement in early nuclear planning, usually in oral history interviews conducted decades after the Cold War ended, expressed a range of reactions. Some maintained that the planning had been necessary and appropriate given the circumstances of the time, that the Soviet threat was real, and that the United States had an obligation to prepare to defend itself and its allies. They viewed their participation in developing Operation Dropshot as a professional duty competently performed, no different in principle from planning any other military operation. The fact that the plan involved nuclear weapons and millions of casualties did not, from this perspective, change the fundamental nature of the military planner's task. Others expressed varying degrees of discomfort, acknowledging that while they had performed their professional duties competently, they had not at the time fully grasped the moral implications of what they were planning. Several noted that the passage of time and the benefit of historical perspective had led them to question assumptions that had seemed self-evident during the height of Cold War tensions. The certainty that the Soviet Union posed an existential threat, the assumption that nuclear war might be winnable, the acceptance of massive civilian casualties as necessary, these beliefs that had seemed obviously correct in 1949 looked more questionable from the perspective of the 1980s or 1990s, after decades of Cold War that had not resulted in the catastrophic war that had been planned for. Some former planners acknowledged in these interviews that they had used psychological distancing mechanisms to cope with the nature of their work, focusing on technical details, using abstract language, treating casualty figures as statistics rather than as human deaths. These mechanisms had allowed them to function professionally while planning operations whose human consequences were almost incomprehensible. Looking back, some expressed regret about this distancing, recognizing that it had allowed them to avoid confronting moral questions that deserved serious engagement. The civilian leadership that authorized the development of Operation Dropshot, President Harry Truman and his senior advisors, faced their own reckoning with the nuclear age. Truman, who had made the decision to use atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945, continued to defend that decision in his post-presidential years, while also expressing concern about the growing destructive power of nuclear weapons. Truman argued that the atomic bombings had ended World War II and saved lives that would have been lost in an invasion of Japan, but he also recognized that the weapons he had authorized using had ushered in a new and dangerous era in human history. In his memoirs, Truman briefly discussed the necessity of planning for various military contingencies, but did not specifically mention Operation Dropshot or detail his knowledge of specific war plans. The extent to which Truman and his advisers engaged seriously with the moral dimensions of nuclear war planning remains a subject of historical debate. Some historians argue that Truman took his responsibilities as commander-in-chief seriously and carefully considered the implications of nuclear weapons. Others suggest that Truman, like many of his contemporaries, did not fully grasp how fundamentally nuclear weapons would change the nature of warfare and international relations. The Soviet leaders who were the intended targets of Operation Dropshot, Joseph Stalin and his senior military commanders, were developing their own war plans during the same period, plans that similarly contemplated massive military operations and that accepted the possibility of enormous casualties. The Soviet Union's own nuclear war planning remained highly classified long after the Cold War ended, and many details remain unknown even today. But declassified Soviet documents from the 1950s make clear that Soviet planners, like their American counterparts, were preparing for total war and were willing to accept catastrophic losses in pursuit of victory. Soviet military doctrine emphasized the importance of offensive operations, of seizing the initiative, of achieving victory through the mass employment of forces. Soviet war plans contemplated rapid advances into Western Europe, potentially reaching the Atlantic coast within weeks. Soviet planners assumed that such a war would involve the use of nuclear weapons by both sides and planned for how Soviet forces would operate in a nuclear environment. The Soviet approach to nuclear weapons, like the American approach embodied in Operation Dropshot, assumed that nuclear war was a form of war that could be fought and won rather than a catastrophe to be avoided at all costs. The Cold War nuclear confrontation was characterized by mirror image planning on both sides, with each superpower developing war plans that assumed the other's aggressive intentions and that prepared for the worst-case scenario. American planners assumed Soviet aggression and prepared for how to defeat it. Soviet planners assumed American aggression and prepared for how to defeat it. Both sides developed increasingly capable nuclear arsenals. Both sides refined their war plans continuously, and both sides convinced themselves that they were acting defensively in response to the other's threats. This dynamic created a situation of mutual fear and mutual preparation that characterized the Cold War for decades. Operation Dropshot was a plan for a war that never happened, prepared by professionals who hoped it never would, in service of a strategy that depended on preventing its own implementation. The physical copies of the plan that were produced and distributed in 1949 were eventually destroyed or relegated to archives as they were superseded by newer plans. The targeting lists were updated as Soviet industrial capacity changed and as American intelligence improved. The operational concepts evolved as new weapons systems became available and as strategic thinking developed. The casualty estimates were revised upward as thermonuclear weapons replaced atomic bombs. By the 1960s, Operation Dropshot was obsolete, a historical artifact of an earlier phase of nuclear planning, interesting primarily to historians studying the evolution of Cold War strategy. But the logic that produced it, the belief that security could be achieved through the threat and, if necessary, the execution of massive destruction, the acceptance of enormous civilian casualties as unavoidable, the subordination of moral questions to operational considerations, that logic persisted throughout the Cold War and, in some forms, persists today. The mechanisms of abstraction and bureaucratic distancing that allowed rational, professional people to plan operations that would kill millions remained features of nuclear planning for decades. The gap between the technical competence of military planning and serious engagement with moral implications remained a persistent characteristic of Cold War strategic culture. The tendency to focus on capabilities rather than consequences, to emphasize what could be done rather than whether it should be done, to treat strategic planning as a technical problem rather than a moral challenge, these tendencies that were evident in Operation Dropshot continued to shape nuclear planning long after the specific plan had been superseded. The assumption that difficult moral questions could be set aside in favor of professional competence, that following orders and performing duties absolved individuals of responsibility for the consequences of their work. These assumptions that made Operation Dropshot possible remained influential throughout the Cold War period. The officers who reviewed Operation Dropshot in December 1949 are all dead now. They served their country as they understood that service, performed their duties with professional competence, and prepared plans they hoped would never be implemented. Whether they fully grasped the moral weight of what they were planning, whether the projected casualties remained comfortably abstract or weighed on their consciences, these questions cannot be answered definitively. Most left no personal records discussing their inner thoughts about the plan. The official documents they produced focused on operational details, not on moral reflections. What they left behind was a document that reveals both the seriousness and the profound moral challenges of Cold War military planning. Operation Dropshot remains in declassified archives now, available to researchers, a testament to how close the world came to catastrophe and how thoroughly the threat of that catastrophe shaped military and political thinking for half a century. The plan was never executed. The bombs outlined in its targeting lists were never dropped. The millions of projected casualties remained theoretical calculations in classified documents rather than historical reality. The Soviet cities that were targeted were never destroyed. The Soviet civilians, who were marked for death in American war plans, lived their lives and died of natural causes, unaware that they had once been data points in targeting tables. The American servicemen who would have flown the bombing missions, who would have fought the conventional campaigns, who would have occupied Soviet territory. They pursued peacetime careers and raised families instead. But the fact that such detailed planning occurred, that it was approved at the highest levels of American military leadership, that capabilities to execute it were developed and maintained, and that similar planning continued for decades, that remains a sobering reminder of how the logic of military strategy and national security can lead rational people to plan irrational destruction. The question Operation Dropshot leaves us with is not whether the planning was competent, it clearly was, but whether that competence in service of potential catastrophe represents the best of human strategic thinking or a profound failure of moral imagination. The answer to that question may depend less on judging the individual planners who created the document than on examining the systems, assumptions, and institutional frameworks that made such planning seem not only acceptable but necessary. Operation Dropshot was not an aberration. It was the logical product of Cold War strategic culture, of the nuclear arms race, of the ideological confrontation between superpowers, and of military institutions tasked with preparing for the worst. Understanding that context does not resolve the moral questions the plan raises, but it does illuminate how ordinary people, acting within extraordinary circumstances, can plan extraordinary destruction while maintaining their sense of professional duty and moral purpose. The legacy of Operation Dropshot extends beyond the specific plan to the broader questions it raises about how democracies prepare for war, how moral considerations relate to strategic planning, how civilian control of the military works in practice, and how human beings cope with the responsibility of planning actions that could end millions of lives. These questions remained relevant throughout the Cold War, remained relevant after the Cold War ended, and remain relevant today in a world where nuclear weapons still exist, where detailed war plans are still maintained, and where the possibility of catastrophic conflict, however remote, has not been eliminated. Operation Dropshot tells us something important about the Cold War, about nuclear strategy, about American military planning, and about human nature. It tells us that smart, educated, professional people can convince themselves that planning mass destruction is not only acceptable, but necessary. It tells us that bureaucratic processes and technical language can make almost anything seem routine and manageable. It tells us that the gap between operational competence and moral wisdom can be vast. And it tells us that the price of security, as conceived during the Cold War, was the willingness to contemplate doing things that in any other context would be regarded as monstrous. Whether that price was worth paying, whether it actually purchased security or merely created the illusion of it, whether alternatives existed that were rejected too quickly. These questions continue to be debated by historians, strategists, and ethicists. What is not debatable is that Operation Dropshot existed, that it represented serious planning by serious people for a war that would have killed tens of millions, and that for decades, similar plans existed on both sides of the Cold War divide, making the world a more dangerous place, even as their creators believed they were making it safer.